Jesus said to turn the other cheek, and yet he told his disciples to buy a sword. How do we reconcile these two statements? The Second Amendment says that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That is, the government of the United States is not to forbid citizens to have deadly weapons for personal protection. This is the legal aspect of the issue, though. And that's only the law of the United States. Some of you may live in countries where the government does not allow you to own a gun. And even if it is legal, buying one may not be easy. But even then, there are other weapons and other means of self-defense. This is not just an issue for American Christians. Guns in America seem to get all the attention. But self-defense is self-defense, whether you use pepper spray, a knife, a rock, or even your hands or your feet to protect yourself. This lesson is not about gun laws in the United States or any other country. We're looking at something deeper in this issue, the moral aspect of self-defense. We're looking at the biblical side of this topic. Is using physical force, even deadly force, consistent with the life and teaching of the Prince of Peace? The right to bear arms in this country is clear, but is it right to bear arms? Some Christians are quick to say, well, of course I believe in owning a gun, but they can't show you where the Bible gives them that right. Then there are other Christians who are against bearing arms, but they misapply the scriptures. That's why we need to do some homework. Let's begin with what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 38, Jesus says these words, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also." What does this mean? And how does it relate to the issue of self-defense? There are some key principles that will help us to understand what Jesus said about turning the other cheek. The first, and I believe the most important, is the context of Matthew chapter 5. This is the section where Jesus said, "You have heard, but I say to you." And you will see that contrast 6 times in Matthew chapter 5. Many people think that Jesus is contrasting his teaching with Moses' teaching, but that's not what he's doing. He is contrasting what the scribes and Pharisees taught about the Old Testament with what the Old Testament actually said. Jesus did not say, "It is written, but I say." He said, "You have heard, but I say." The key goes back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. Jesus said, "Whoever therefore breaks one of these least commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven." Jesus is aiming this at the scribes and the Pharisees. That's clear in the next verse. The scribes and the Pharisees broke some of the commandments of God. They also taught the scriptures they agreed with, but they set aside the parts that they disagreed with. Jesus said to be in his kingdom, we have to do better. We must accept all the Lord said, not just parts of what he said. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus said, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." The scribes and Pharisees were guilty of picking and choosing commandments of God. They were partial. They were hypocritical. They made a huge deal out of breaking some commandments, and then they ignored others that were more serious. Now, that's what Jesus is condemning in this chapter. The first example is in Matthew chapter 5, 21 and 22. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Reka, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hell fire." Scribes and Pharisees taught that it was wrong to murder. It was. "You shall not murder" is one of the 10 commandments, Exodus 20, verse 13. The scribes and the Pharisees were right in teaching this, but they left something out. They didn't emphasize what the Old Testament said about hatred and spite and contempt. Leviticus 19, verse 17 said, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart." So Jesus is not saying, this is what the law of Moses said, but here's what my law says. What he is saying is this: The law of Moses said this, but it also said more. But the scribes and Pharisees claim to be teachers of the law, and they only teach the parts that they accept. Here's another example. In Matthew 5:27 and 28, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Jesus is not teaching that the Old Testament only condemned the outward act of adultery, but his new law condemns lust in the heart as well as physical adultery. The truth is, the Old Testament condemned both. "You shall not commit adultery" is one of the 10 commandments, Exodus 20 verse 14. But the last of the 10 commandments says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife," Deuteronomy 5 verse 21. Proverbs 6 verse 25 warns, "Do not lust after her beauty in your heart." Job said, "I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman?" Job 31 verse 1. So it's a mistake to say that the Old Testament addressed the outward act, but not the heart. The scribes and Pharisees also abused what the law said about divorce. Matthew 5:31 and 32. They quoted Moses' law on divorce in Deuteronomy 24 verse 1, but they misused that passage to justify divorce for all kinds of frivolous reasons. Deuteronomy 24 verse 1 taught that there was a place for the bill of divorce, but the scribes and Pharisees ignored passages like Malachi chapter 2, 13 through 16, which set limits on divorce. The same is true of swearing in Matthew 5, 33 through 37. Jewish leaders quoted Old Testament verses about the seriousness of an oath, but they abused that teaching. They over-applied it to every little commitment in everyday life. Jesus said there's no need to swear about trivial things if you're honest. Now, this brings us back to Matthew 5, verse 38. The Old Testament did teach an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Exodus 21, Leviticus 24. There was nothing wrong with that law. It simply said that if you wrong someone, you should get the same treatment in return, even to the point of having your life taken if you kill someone. It was a law about justice. But the scribes and Pharisees took it to an extreme. They were so set on getting justice that they ignored what the Old Testament said about mercy. Justice has a place, but so does mercy. The Old Testament taught both, but the Jews kept one and discarded the other. So just like the other examples that we've looked at in Matthew chapter 5 before this, Jesus is not saying in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 and 39, that he's against justice. He is teaching that mercy is just as important. The second principle to keep in mind is the historical setting. And what I mean by that is this. Have you ever noticed how many times Jesus talks about the need for mercy in the book of Matthew, which, as we oftentimes teach, was written especially for the Jewish mindset? He quoted Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. "I desire mercy and not sacrifice." He quoted that twice to the hard-hearted Jewish leaders, Matthew 9:13 and Matthew chapter 12, verse 7. He said that they had neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith, Matthew 23, verse 23. We have to remember the mindset of these Jews. These people were selfish. They were vindictive. They condemned each other over the smallest offenses. We read about that in Matthew 7, 1 through 5. The scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus said, devoured widows' houses, Matthew 23, verse 14. In other words, they showed no mercy. The rabbis had even invented a tradition called Corban, which said that Jews didn't have to help their needy parents if they dedicated money to the temple. Mark 7, verses 1 through 13. The parable of the unmerciful servant in Matthew chapter 18 and the great judgment scene in Matthew 25 both show the need for mercy. In Jesus' day, if anybody wronged these Jews or owed them in the least way, intentionally or unintentionally, they demanded justice to the fullest extent of the law. And if you ask them why they did this, they would quote these words, "Haven't you ever heard? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." So how did Jesus deal with a heart problem like this? He couldn't just gently urge these people to show compassion toward other people. He had to be severe with them. They had gone to an extreme, and Jesus had to use extreme language to pull them back to center. That's why Jesus used the language of hyperbole. which is a figure of speech that is a deliberate, intentional exaggeration for emphasis. This is common in the Sermon on the Mount. It's hard to really understand and interpret the Sermon on the Mount unless you remember these figures of speech. Just a few verses earlier, Jesus said, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Matthew 5:29 and 30. Jesus cannot mean that we are to literally pluck out our physical eye or cut off our physical hand. Why would anyone assume that Jesus means for us to literally turn the other cheek when we know he didn't mean for us to literally cut off our hand just a few verses before this? Then in Matthew 6, Jesus talks about hypocrites sounding a trumpet. He says we're not to let our left hand know what our right hand is doing. Matthew 6, 2 through 3. In Matthew 7, verse 5, he talks about a hypocrite with a beam of wood in his eyes. If those verses are figures, then it shouldn't be strange that turning the other cheek is a hyperbole. Jesus did not literally turn the other cheek when he was before the high priest in John chapter 18. One of the officers struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, but Jesus reproved him. He said, if I have spoken evil, then bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? Verse 23. Now, it's true that Jesus did not retaliate physically, which would hardly have been possible anyway because he had been arrested. But he did resist. He did not invite the officer to strike him again. Now, Jesus also says in Matthew chapter 5, if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. That's verses 40 through 42. These statements cannot be literal, universal, unqualified commands. For instance, Jesus said to give to one who asks. Does that mean that a poor man is to take food from his children and give it to a man who's too lazy to work just because he asks? Obviously not. We have to take Jesus' words in context. And I'm talking about the context of the Bible as a whole, because Paul said that a man who won't work shouldn't eat. 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10. We have to look at the spirit of these statements and not press the application beyond the context of the Jewish audience. Jesus is not giving a new interpretation or a radical application of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He's just stating the meaning in a different and a more poetic way. What he says does not contradict Old Testament teaching. It doesn't supersede Old Testament law. It simply qualifies it. Jesus put this teaching in its proper realm of application because the Pharisees had over-applied it. Now you may say, but what about the next verses? Because Jesus said in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. That's verse 33 or 43 and 44. How does that relate to the issue of a Christian and self-defense? You might ask, well, how can you love your enemy and use force, even deadly force, against him? Again, we have to make sure that we understand what Jesus said. In verse 43, he said, you have heard that it was said. Who was it that taught them? From whom did they hear this? The answer is they heard it from the popular teachers of the day, the scribes and the Pharisees. That goes all the way back to verses 19 and 20. Jesus gave those 5 examples that we looked at. And in every case, they twisted the scriptures. They quoted part of what God said, and they left out the parts they didn't want to do. Verse 43 is no different. The scribes and Pharisees quoted Leviticus 19 verse 18. You shall love your neighbor. That part was good. But then they added these words, hate your enemy. That was not in the Old Testament. The law of Moses did not command Jews to hate their enemies. In fact, in Exodus chapter 23, beginning in verse 4, Moses said, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would, that is, you want to, you feel like refraining from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. Solomon said this in Proverbs chapter 25. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. So you will heap coals of fire on his head, and the Lord will reward you. That's verse 21 and 22. So the law said to help your enemy, not hate him. The Pharisees twisted what the scriptures taught on this. They taught Jews to love fellow Jews, but hate Gentiles. The commandment to love your neighbor as yourself was clear. The Old Testament was plain about that, but they looked for ways to circumvent that law. Do you remember the lawyer who quoted these very words to Jesus, and yet the Bible says wanting or willing to justify himself? He said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Luke 10:29, he was looking for a loophole. When Jesus said, "But I say to you," he's not denying what the law said. He is objecting to what the scribes and Pharisees taught. That is, they taught, hate your enemy. Now, it's very important to ask here, what kind of enemy is Jesus talking about? He says this enemy is one who might curse you, not kill you. This is a person who hates you, not someone who's trying to physically harm you. This enemy wants to spitefully use you, not someone who's threatening your life. This is someone who persecutes you. That can't be persecution to the point of death, because you'd be dead already. You wouldn't be able to pray for this person like Jesus says. These are attacks on the character of a Christian, not the life and safety of a Christian. When Jesus said to love your enemy, he cannot mean love in the sense of having warm feelings like the affection you feel toward your children. He can't mean to love your enemy in the same way that a husband and wife love each other. This is love in doing rather than feeling. It's love as a decision more than love as devotion. It's love from the will rather than love from emotion. In that sense, we pray for and do good to our enemies. But this has nothing to do with someone who intends to do us physical harm. In other words, when Jesus said to bless this enemy, he's not talking about a violent criminal who's about to rape and kill women and children. He's not telling a woman just to say, "God bless you," to an animal like that. It is a misapplication to apply Jesus' words about turning the other cheek so that people can forbid physical self-defense, the death penalty, or a Christian serving in law enforcement or the military. Now let's go outside of the Sermon on the Mount to see what we can learn about Jesus' view of using physical force. We need to look at the overall context of Jesus' life and his teaching, and not just one passage. In John chapter 2, the Bible says this: "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables." Verse 13 through 15. The amazing thing is that Jesus did this a second time, evidently 3 years later, in Matthew 21. The Bible, I would admit, doesn't specifically say that Jesus struck these men with the whip that he made. It doesn't, for that matter, even specifically say that he used it to hit the sheep and the oxen. But it would seem strange that he would take the time to make this whip with no thought of using it. And it would seem reasonable to say that if he had the right to wield this whip, then he had the right to use it. Still, even at that, the record does say that he turned over their tables and drove them out. He didn't ask them to leave. He didn't reason with them or debate them. He drove them out against their will. So regardless of the extent of the coercion that he used on this occasion, this story in John 2 shows that Jesus was not the completely passive, non-resistant Savior that some people think they see in the Sermon on the Mount. But there is a more direct passage. Do you realize that Jesus told the disciples to carry a sword? Here's the record in Luke chapter 22. "Then he said to them, 'When I sent you without money bag, knapsack, and sandals, Did you lack anything?" So they said, "Nothing." Then he said to them, "But now he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you that this which is written must still be accomplished. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For the things concerning me have an end." So they said, "Lord, look, here are 2 swords." And he said to them, "It is enough." That's Luke 22:35 through 39. When he says in verse 35 that he had sent them out earlier without a money bag and other supplies, he was talking about the limited commission in Luke 10 and Matthew 10. But this time, he says they will need to take money in a money bag. They will need to take supplies in a knapsack. And he says, this time you will need protection. That's why Jesus said, if you don't have a sword, sell your garment and buy one. In the limited commission, Jesus told them not to even take a staff. In Bible times, a staff had different uses, one of which was self-defense against animals or against humans. But this time, Jesus did not just say to take a staff for some kind of general purpose. He told them to take a sword. Now consider what this meant in the first century. Jesus could have told them to take a staff, but he was more specific. He said to take a sword. Today, a sword is a relic of ancient history. It's an item displayed in a museum. But everyone in Jesus' day understood what it represented. They knew that swords were meant for killing. They were not made simply to maim or to wound. They certainly weren't made just to clear brush or to cut down small trees. A sword was the symbol of the power to take human life. For instance, Paul said that civil government bears the sword. Romans 13, verse 4. That doesn't just mean that Roman soldiers wore a sword at their side for show. It means they carried it for a purpose and they stood ready to use it. Owning a sword was so important that Jesus said to sell your garment and buy one. People then didn't have as many clothes as we do today. This shows how urgent this was for his disciples. Jesus is talking about the disciples going out after he ascended to heaven and after the church was established. They were to go into all the world under the Great Commission, Mark 16:15. They would face dangers in their travels. Paul later said in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 26, that he faced perils of robbers in his journeys. You remember the story of the Good Samaritan because it talks about thieves beating a man half to death. Luke 10, verse 30. The old world was dangerous in some places, just like our world is today. The disciples would need some protection. So Jesus said, if you don't have a sword, buy one, even if you have to sell some of your clothes. Buying a sword back then was tantamount to us saying today, buy a gun. Both are made for self-protection, even to the point of taking an attacker's life. This is clear proof that Jesus did not teach absolute non-resistance in the Sermon on the Mount. Some commentaries say that Jesus was speaking figuratively or symbolically when he said to buy a sword. And I would ask, what does that mean? If Jesus was not talking about literal swords, then what does he mean when he says to buy one? If the sword he mentions is symbolic, then what would that sword symbolize? What would it represent? The only thing that comes close is Ephesians 6, verse 17, where Paul said the sword of the Spirit is the word of God, but that interpretation does not fit this context. All the other items Jesus told them to take were literal. Jesus told the disciples to take a money bag. Was that literal or symbolic? He said, take a knapsack. Was that literal or figurative? Then he said, in the same breath, buy a sword. The disciples said they had 2 swords, and they were talking about 2 literal physical swords. If the money bag and the knapsack are literal, then so is the sword. Besides, why did Jesus say it is enough when they showed him 2 literal swords if he was only speaking symbolically? Someone might ask this, But how could 2 swords be enough for 12 men? Consider what Jesus said about taking a money bag as an illustration. Before this time, Judas Iscariot carried the bag, that is the money bag, for the other disciples. John 12, verse 6, John 13, verse 29. But after Jesus' death, Jesus said each one of them would need to carry his own money bag. In the same way, Jesus is saying 2 swords are enough for now, until these disciples could buy more later. At the time he spoke, the 2 swords they had would serve the purpose. They certainly couldn't go out and buy a sword at this time of the night anyway. The fact that the disciples already had these swords is interesting. Jesus knew the disciples had those swords. He permitted them to carry those swords. He's not telling them to do something in Luke chapter 22 that's new. He certainly didn't tell them to throw away their swords. He told them to buy more swords. One of the disciples who already carried one of those swords was Peter. When the Jewish crowd came to the garden with clubs and swords to arrest Jesus, Peter pulled out his sword and he struck the ear of one of them. Jesus told him, "Put up your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Matthew 26, verse 52. This cannot mean that Jesus is telling Peter that any and all uses of the sword are wrong. It wouldn't make any sense for Jesus to urge the disciples shortly before this to buy a sword and then tell them never to use it. He didn't tell Peter to throw away his sword. He told him to put it in its place. There is a time and a place for using the sword. This was not it. Jesus came to give his life willingly for the sins of the world. So we commend Peter for his courage. He was no coward. But 2 swords were no match for a huge crowd like this. And more importantly, Jesus said that the scriptures had to be fulfilled. So what did Jesus mean then when he said, all who take the sword will perish by the sword? He means taking the sword rashly and as a rule of life. The sword has its place in just punishment and in protection, whether in national interest or in personal life. But using the sword as a way of life in general can only lead to one end. You might ask, but what about what Jesus said in John 18:36? This is where Jesus said to Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate was a Roman king. He had asked Jesus if he was a king, the king of the Jews. Pilate meant a king like himself, a political ruler with civil authority. And Jesus told him, "I'm not that kind of king." He said if he had been this kind of king, like this Roman official, then he says, my servants would fight to protect me from the Jews. That's what earthly powers do. They protect their ruler. Jesus is speaking hypothetically. He said if he had been an earthly king like Pilate, his officers would have fought to keep the Jews from taking him. We have to keep in mind an old, simple rule of Bible interpretation. To whom is he speaking? Pilate certainly understood this reasoning. When Jesus said his servants would have fought to protect him if his kingdom had been of this world, he used the Greek word huperetes, which is translated servants in many translations. The more common word for servant in the Bible is doulos. Huperetes can mean a servant in general, but it oftentimes refers to officers. This is very interesting. The American Standard Version has servants in the text of John chapter 18 that we just read. In the margin, it says officers. This Greek word that we mentioned is translated officers throughout this chapter. John 18 verse 3 says, Judas brought a band of men and officers with him. John 18 verse 12 says those men and officers arrested Jesus. This word is distinguished from servants in John chapter 18 verse 18. It mentions both the servants, douloi, and the officers, which would be huperetai. Now, that is the sense of the word in John chapter 18 verse 36. When Jesus said that his officers would have fought if his kingdom had been a political power, he was not talking about his 12 apostles or even his disciples in general. Again, He's speaking hypothetically to make a point to this earthly ruler who does not understand the nature of Jesus' kingship. That's all he's saying. He's simply stating a fact to answer Pilate's question about whether he was a king. He's not making a statement about individual self-defense. He's not addressing the question of a government's power to protect itself by just war. He had already told the disciples to buy a sword. So when Jesus stood before Pilate, he wouldn't contradict what he had told the disciples just a short time before he was arrested. Jesus was the sinless, loving Savior who told the disciples to purchase a deadly weapon. That deadly weapon was a sword. Guns weren't invented for well over 1,000 years later. But guns are not the only aspect of this issue of Christian self-defense. A stick, a rock, or even a hand or a foot, or a knee or an elbow can injure or kill a person. If Jesus teaches absolute non-resistance in the Sermon on the Mount, that would mean that a woman could not even kick an attacker on the shin, poke him in the eye, or even shove him and then run. Jesus authorized individuals to use self-defense. He and Moses agree on this point. For instance, consider what Moses said in Exodus chapter 22, verse 2. He said, "If the thief is found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed." The situation was common then, just like it is today. An intruder breaks into a house at night with people inside. This law plainly gave Jews the right to defend themselves, even to the point of taking the life of the attacker. This is a clear passage about self-defense in the Old Testament. And that same law was careful to distinguish killing in self-defense from killing in cold blood. Earlier, in Exodus chapter 21, Moses wrote, "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death." This is premeditated killing, according to the context of Exodus 21, 13, and 14. Also, in Exodus chapter 22, verse 3, the law forbade a Jew to kill a thief that he caught stealing in the daytime. In that situation, the thief was to be brought before the judges and then punished in that situation. But at night, the owner could not see who the thief was. He couldn't know if the thief had a weapon. He might not know if the thief was coming toward him to attack or trying to get away. So the law gave leniency to the side of the victim of the crime, not the perpetrator of it. If there was a real possibility that the intruder might harm those inside the house, then the owner was justified in using force to defend his family, even if that meant killing someone. Somebody might object, "Well, that's in the Old Testament though, and we're not under that law today. We're under the law of Christ." The problem with that reasoning is that not everything in the law of Moses was a temporary law for the Jews only. Specific religious observances like the Sabbath and circumcision were nailed to the cross. Colossians 2:14 says that. But the basic moral principles are the same. Murder was wrong under the law, and it's wrong today. So are lying and adultery and stealing. The right of self-defense is no different. Moses and Jesus both taught it. They're in agreement on that point, not at odds with each other. There's a similar verse in the New Testament about breaking and entering. It's in Matthew 24, verse 43. Here is where Jesus said, "But this know, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into." Jesus said this man would not allow the thief to break into his house, which means he had to have used force. So does this verse prove the right of self-defense? This is an illustration. And when an illustration is used, we need to look for the overall point of the illustration, not every detail in it. Jesus is teaching us to be ready for his coming. That's what he says in the next verse, verse 44. So consider the other side of this figure. Paul and Peter both said that Jesus will come like a thief in the night. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 2, 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. Those verses obviously don't approve of what a thief does, stealing. It's the overall element or aspect of surprise. That's the purpose of the illustration. So for this reason, I would say that an argument from Matthew 24, verse 43 is probably not a good verse to support self-defense. At least we can say that the other passages are more clear. Another aspect of this issue is the question of moral duty. Do we have a moral obligation to protect human life? Jesus asked the critical Jews in the synagogue in Mark chapter 3, verse 4, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Jesus taught that saving human life is a good thing. Paul warned in 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. A man ought to provide food and clothing for his family. He has a moral duty to shelter them from bad weather, and he has a responsibility to protect them. For instance, if a bear is about to attack his wife and his children, a man ought to do whatever he can to protect them. A vicious criminal is no different. Peter said some men are like natural brute beasts, made to be caught and destroyed. 2 Peter 2, verse 12. Some men are brutal sociopaths. They feel no remorse for killing innocent people, and they are like wild, dangerous animals. How could anyone think that the Sermon on the Mount forbids us to interfere with a rapist or a murderer? It's not wrong to protect others from such evil. It's wrong if we don't. A Christian who is against using force in those situations would have to explain how it could be right just to stand back and do nothing. Now, he might say that all this is just hypothetical. He might say that God in His providence will keep Christians from those situations where they will face that danger. It is true that the Lord does watch over His people, but that doesn't mean that He always keeps us from every human threat any more than He keeps us from every other danger like bad weather or disease. Saying we should not use self-defense because God will spare us is like refusing any form of medical care on the grounds that God will take care of us anyway. Jesus said that sick people need a doctor, Matthew 9, verse 12. This is the same Lord who told the disciples to buy a sword if they didn't have one. Why would Jesus say this if God was going to shield them from all danger anyway? Some Christians object to bearing arms because of their misuse. Some people have lost relatives in mass shootings or accidental shootings. Others have been caught in the middle of gang wars. Some have been through horrific combat situations. These experiences can leave a negative feeling about carrying a weapon. Thus, we should respect every man's conscience. But we must not overreact. If Jesus gave this right, we have no right to deny it. There are no doubt complex cases where difficult legal decisions have to be made. We need to pray for law enforcement and for lawmakers, judges, and juries throughout our land. We will never have perfect justice on this or any other moral issue, but we must not make the mistake that's so common of letting abuses of a right lead us to deny that right. The right of self-defense must not be laid to rest by death from 1,000 exceptions to the rule, extenuating circumstances, and legal precedents. But this is far more than a constitutional issue. It's a biblical issue. We shouldn't interpret the Bible in light of the Second Amendment. We should read the Second Amendment in light of the Bible. The Second Amendment did not give us the right to bear arms. It merely affirms that right. The Lord gave us that right. There's just something